The sun was setting on a world that was beginning to unravel. Cities once filled with life now stood eerily silent, with no birds chirping or sounds of distant traffic. In the sprawling city of Millbrook, life had been perfect, at least for the first few hours after the initial outbreak. But that comfort was fleeting. The virus that had begun spreading like wildfire was not just a plague, it was a death sentence, turning the infected into mindless, ravenous creatures. No one knew where it came from or how it spread so quickly, but by the time the first reports were made, it was too late. Sarah, a survivalist who'd once scoffed at the idea of the apocalypse, stood at the window of her small apartment, watching the chaos unfold below. She was no stranger to disaster scenarios, having read countless books and watched every prepper documentary. But no book had ever prepared her for what she was witnessing now. The streets were filled with screams, some of terror, others of pain, as people fled from the horde of flesh-eating monsters that once looked like their friends and neighbors. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the message. It was from Mike, her brother. "Get to the compound. Now." She hesitated. The compound was a well-stocked survivalist hideaway her family had set up months ago, far from the city's chaos. But there were too many risks involved in trying to make it out. The roads were clogged with panicked drivers, and the infected were everywhere. The safe havens that had once been talked about were no more. The world was already far past the point of containment. She looked out over the city again, watching the fires burn in the distance. A loud crash snapped her from her thoughts. She spun around to find the front door wide open. Her heart stopped. Someone, or something, was inside. She quickly grabbed a baseball bat from her closet, holding her breath as footsteps echoed down the hallway. The doorknob rattled, and her hand tightened around the bat. She stepped forward slowly, ready to swing at anything that came through the door. Just as the door creaked open, a familiar face appeared, a neighbor from down the hall, Michael. His face was covered in dirt, and his eyes wide with fear. "Sarah, you have to come with me. They're everywhere. It's a bloodbath out there. We're not safe here anymore." His voice shook, desperation lacing his words. Sarah didn't need any further convincing. She quickly grabbed her bag and nodded. "Let's go." Together, they hurried through the building's narrow stairwell, avoiding the chaos that was spiraling throughout the complex. As they made their way outside, Sarah saw the devastation in full force. The once bustling streets were now choked with abandoned cars, burning wreckage, and bodies, some of which twitched with life as the virus claimed its next victims. "Where's your family?" Sarah asked, glancing at Michael as they hurried toward her car. "I couldn't find them," Michael responded, his voice cracking. "They were supposed to meet me, but I couldn't wait any longer. We need to get out of here now." Sarah looked around, knowing that if they stayed here for too long, they'd be trapped. The only chance at survival was getting out of the city and heading toward the compound. The streets of Millbrook had become a battleground. From the safety of her car, Sarah could barely see past the dense smoke rising from burning buildings. The hum of the engine was drowned out by the distant wail of sirens and the blood-curdling growls of the undead. The only thing that mattered now was survival, and the only way to survive was to get to the compound. The car bounced over cracked pavement, swerving around abandoned vehicles that had been left in a panic. Michael sat in the passenger seat, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously to every corner of their surroundings. "Keep your head down," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm as she steered through the chaos. "We don't stop for anything." But even as she spoke, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It was as if the world had collapsed overnight, leaving them to fend for themselves in a wasteland of horror. The streets that had once been filled with people now seemed like a ghost town, but she knew better than to believe it was safe. The undead were everywhere, lurking in the shadows, hiding in the ruins. They drove for miles, with every turn bringing them closer to danger. The road that led out of Millbrook was a mess of abandoned vehicles, and the once clear highway was now choked with debris. There were no signs of life, only the occasional, chilling glimpse of a zombie dragging itself along the roadside. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel as she pushed the car to its limits, trying to avoid the growing number of obstacles. At one point, they had to take a detour through an industrial area, hoping to bypass the worst of the congestion. The buildings here were dilapidated, abandoned long before the outbreak had begun. But as they drove past the empty warehouses, Sarah spotted something in the corner of her eye: movement. "Stop the car!" Michael hissed, his voice full of urgency. Sarah slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt. She peered through the rearview mirror, but all she saw were empty streets. Still, she could feel it, the weight of something watching them. A loud crash suddenly echoed from the alley to their left. Before Sarah could react, a horde of zombies staggered out into the street, drawn by the sound of the car. They were slow, stumbling, but there were so many of them. "Go! Go!" Michael screamed, his panic evident. "We don't have time." Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed the gas pedal down, sending the car lurching forward. The zombies were closing in fast, their limbs jerking erratically as they tried to reach the vehicle. A low growl erupted from behind them as one of the undead slammed into the back bumper. The car fishtailed, narrowly avoiding a group of the infected, but they were still gaining on them. The car's engine roared as Sarah swerved around another obstacle, the air thick with the stench of burning rubber and rotting flesh. "I can't keep this up!" Michael shouted, his voice rising with fear. "They're everywhere!" "We're almost there," Sarah said, gripping the wheel tightly as they tore through the industrial zone. The compound was still hours away, but she couldn't afford to lose their lead. They needed to outrun the pack and find shelter before it was too late. Suddenly, Sarah saw it, a large overpass ahead, a potential way to escape the mob. If they could just make it through that gap, they'd be free from the immediate danger. But as they neared the overpass, Sarah's heart sank. Another group of zombies appeared on the other side, blocking their path. "We're trapped!" Michael shouted in a panic. Sarah's mind raced, her instincts kicking in. Without another thought, she turned the wheel sharply, sending the car crashing through the barricade of wrecked vehicles and debris that had piled up along the side of the road. The car lurched forward, the engine sputtering as it slammed into a pile of old shipping containers. But the zombies were still coming, too close now. "Out, now!" Sarah yelled. She and Michael scrambled out of the car, adrenaline pumping as they ran toward a nearby building. Behind them, the sound of zombies closing in grew louder, the growls and snarls a terrifying reminder of what would happen if they didn't escape. They reached the building just in time, ducking inside as the horde closed in behind them. Sarah slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, all was silent except for the sound of their racing hearts. "We can't stay here long," Sarah said, her voice low. "They'll find us eventually." Michael nodded, sweat dripping down his forehead. He glanced back at the door, knowing the danger wasn't over yet. The world was no longer a safe place, and every moment felt like a gamble. But one thing was certain, they had survived this first wave. And if they were going to make it to the compound, they would need to keep moving. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, already scanning the room for their next move. And with that, their journey into the heart of the apocalypse truly began. The sound of the zombies pounding against the door grew louder as Sarah and Michael stood motionless in the darkened room, hearts pounding. The old warehouse they had taken refuge in wasn't exactly secure. They both knew it was just a matter of time before the undead broke through or found another way in. The silence in the building seemed to stretch on, amplifying every noise. "We need to move," Sarah whispered, breaking the silence. "The longer we stay here, the more likely we are to be surrounded." Michael nodded, his face pale from both fear and exhaustion. His eyes kept darting back toward the door. The once strong, confident man she had known was now fragile, on the verge of breaking. They were both pushed to their limits, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Sarah checked her watch. It had been hours since they'd left the city, but they were still far from the compound. The further they ventured into this new world, the more difficult it became to make progress. Every road they tried was blocked, and every turn led them deeper into uncertainty. The only certainty was that they couldn't stop. They gathered their belongings, water bottles, snacks, a flashlight, and a few weapons they had scavenged along the way, and cautiously moved through the warehouse. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the shadows. Every step felt like a potential misstep, every sound a warning. As they made their way toward the back exit, Sarah's mind raced. She had planned for scenarios like this. She had studied, prepared, but no amount of planning could have prepared her for what she was facing now. The world had changed, and so had she. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore, she was trying to hold on to her humanity. Michael broke her train of thought. "We've got to be close, right? The compound's not that far, is it?" His voice trembled with hope, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. They'd been on the road for what felt like forever, and every mile was more treacherous than the last. "We're getting there," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Just hang on." They pushed forward into the night, taking a detour around the overpass they had tried to cross earlier. The streets were quieter now, but Sarah knew better than to think it was safe. Zombies didn't always move in packs. They could be lurking anywhere, in any alley, just waiting for a sign of life. As they navigated the twisted, abandoned roads, Sarah's thoughts kept returning to the world they had left behind. The world before the outbreak had been simple, predictable. Now, it was a twisted version of itself, a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Eventually, they stumbled upon a gas station, long since abandoned but still mostly intact. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some shelter and a place to rest. They checked the station carefully for any signs of life, or undead life, before cautiously entering. Inside, the place looked like a time capsule, frozen in the days before the chaos started. The shelves were stocked with non-perishable food, and a cooler still hummed faintly in the corner. But the overwhelming silence weighed on them as they moved through the aisles, collecting what they could find. "Do you think we'll make it?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was looking at the supplies they'd gathered, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, worrying about the unknown. "We have to," Sarah replied, though doubt gnawed at her as well. She had planned to survive, she had to survive. But she had learned that survival came at a price. Her family was gone. The world she once knew had vanished in a matter of days. And now, it was just her and Michael, a fragile thread holding on in an unraveling world. As they filled their bags with what little they could carry, Sarah's eyes caught something out of the corner of her eye. It was a map, folded and forgotten, wedged between a stack of old magazines. She grabbed it, unfolding it carefully. The map detailed the area around Millbrook and beyond. The compound was marked on it, only a few more miles. It was close. Too close to turn back now. But as she traced the path on the map, a cold feeling settled in her chest. The closer they got to their destination, the more dangerous it would be. The horde would grow, and if they didn't keep moving, they would be trapped. "We'll get there," Sarah said more to herself than to Michael, the resolve in her voice growing stronger. "We have to." Suddenly, a noise outside caught their attention. A distant groan, followed by the sound of footsteps. The door of the gas station rattled slightly as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. Sarah froze. The undead were close. Too close. "We've got to go. Now," she hissed. She grabbed Michael's arm, and together they rushed out the back door, once again entering the night. The world outside was dark and full of dangers, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. There was no safe haven anymore. No guaranteed escape. Just one goal: survive. The darkness of the night was oppressive, the only light coming from the dim glow of distant fires that flickered in the city's ruins. The night had become their greatest adversary, as the hordes of zombies were much more difficult to track in the pitch black. The only sounds that filled the air were their footsteps and the occasional distant moans of the undead. Sarah and Michael moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main roads as much as possible. The tension between them had grown, the strain of constant running and hiding slowly eating away at their nerves. Every step felt like a gamble. They were exhausted, but their destination was in sight. The compound wasn't far now. But as they moved deeper into the night, the realization hit that there was no telling what would happen once they arrived. They had learned one thing over the past few hours: the world had changed, and no one could be trusted anymore. As they walked through a narrow alleyway, Sarah motioned for Michael to be quiet. Her ears had picked up a sound, a faint scraping noise, followed by a thud. She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, holding her breath. Michael nodded, his face tense. It didn't sound like a zombie. The scraping noise was too deliberate, too controlled. Suddenly, the sound grew louder, closer, and then a figure appeared in the darkness ahead of them. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively reached for the weapon at her side, an old hunting knife she had found earlier in a supply store. The figure stepped forward cautiously, their silhouette illuminated for a brief moment by the glow of a nearby fire. Sarah's grip tightened on the knife, ready to strike if needed. But then, the figure spoke. "Hold up." The voice was gruff, but calm. "I'm not one of them." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she took a step back. Michael, who had been walking closely behind her, froze. Both of them were on edge, unsure of what to expect. The figure stepped closer, revealing more details. A tall man, perhaps in his late 30s, with rough, unshaven features and a jacket that looked like it had been through hell. His face was covered in dirt, his eyes tired but sharp. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and a backpack that looked well stocked. "My name's Jack," he said, his voice a little softer now. "I'm just trying to survive, same as you. I can see you've got a plan, but you won't get far without backup." He paused, looking from Sarah to Michael, sizing them up. "The city's crawling with them, and you're out here alone. You need help." Sarah kept her distance, her eyes flicking from the man to the dark streets around them. She wasn't sure if she could trust him. There had been too many encounters with strangers who had tried to deceive or manipulate them, too many false promises of safety that turned out to be traps. "You can't trust anyone out here," she said, her voice low, her suspicion clear. Jack shrugged. "I get it. I wouldn't trust anyone either, not after what we've all seen." He glanced over his shoulder nervously. "But you can't do this alone. I've got supplies, water, food, ammo. And I know a safer route to get to where you're going." Sarah hesitated, her instincts fighting with the need for help. They had no choice but to trust someone, but how could they be sure Jack wasn't leading them into a trap? "We're headed to a compound," Michael spoke up, his voice uncertain but desperate. "We've been trying to get there for hours." Jack's expression softened. "I know the place. I've been to that compound before. It's good, secure." His eyes narrowed, as if remembering something unpleasant. "But you should know, nothing's safe anymore. The compound's not as safe as it used to be." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Jack looked around, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I've heard rumors. People in charge there aren't exactly trustworthy. There are some who've been making deals with others, deals that could cost you everything. But if you really want to get there, I can show you the way. We just need to be careful. The last thing you want is to wander into an ambush. The undead aren't the only danger now." The words hung heavy in the air. Trust was in short supply, and yet Sarah realized they were running out of time. They had to make a decision. Could they really afford to keep moving alone, risking running into more zombies or even worse, human threats? Or could Jack be telling the truth? She exchanged a glance with Michael. The uncertainty in his eyes mirrored her own. "Fine," Sarah said finally, her voice firm. "We'll go with you. But if you try anything, we won't hesitate." Jack smiled, a brief, tense grin. "Fair enough." With that, the three of them continued down the alley, with Jack leading the way. As they walked, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something bigger than zombies was coming, something darker that threatened to make the undead look like mere obstacles in the road. They were about to enter a world where survival wasn't just about fighting the dead. It was about surviving the living too. The journey through the dark streets felt longer than it had been. The air was thick with tension as they followed Jack, whose confident strides barely seemed to slow as he led them through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Despite their growing suspicion, Sarah and Michael knew they had little choice but to trust him, at least for now. The city's outskirts were still a maze of destruction, and every building felt like a potential hiding spot for both the undead and worse. With every turn they took, the sense of danger seemed to rise. Sarah felt her instincts sharpening, her senses heightened. Her body was on high alert as they navigated through abandoned streets and silent alleys. They hadn't seen many zombies in the last few hours, but Sarah knew the silence was only temporary. They were close to the edge of the city now. Jack had said the compound was just a few miles away. But even as they drew closer, the air seemed to grow heavier with a sense of impending doom. The compound was supposed to be a sanctuary, a safe place amidst the madness. But now, Sarah wasn't sure if such a thing could exist anymore. "Keep up," Jack called back, his voice cutting through the night's eerie quiet. His steps were sure and steady, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived too much to be afraid. Michael looked over at Sarah, his face tense with worry. "Do you trust him?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to admit how unsure she felt. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, and yet, they were running out of options. She had seen how quickly desperation could turn a person into something dangerous. The world was full of betrayal, and there were no safe havens left. "I don't know," Sarah replied quietly. "But right now, he's our best shot." They kept walking in silence, the sound of their footsteps the only thing that broke the stillness of the night. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the abandoned buildings grew fewer. The roads became more isolated. The once bustling neighborhoods were now ghost towns, only the occasional broken window or overturned car marking where life had once been. Finally, Jack came to a stop. He turned around to face them, his eyes scanning the area before locking onto Sarah. "This is where we part ways," Jack said, his voice low, almost regretful. "The compound is just up ahead, but you'll need to be careful. The last stretch is the most dangerous." Sarah felt her heart drop. "What do you mean?" Jack hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to Michael before returning to Sarah. "I told you before. The compound's not as safe as it used to be. There are people there who have their own agendas. They'll do anything to maintain control." "What are you saying?" Michael's voice was tight with confusion. "Are you telling us not to go?" Jack shook his head slowly. "No. I'm just saying, be prepared. The compound may offer shelter, but there's no telling who you'll find when you get there. Trust is a rare commodity now. And in a place like that, betrayal can come from anyone, especially those who think they're in charge." Sarah frowned, unsure of what to believe. "So, you're just going to leave us here?" Jack looked away, clearly conflicted. "I'm not staying. There's a group nearby, they're dangerous. I'm leaving before they notice me. But you," he trailed off, his voice hardening. "If you go to the compound, you'll need to keep your eyes open. You don't know what you're walking into." For a moment, there was a tense silence. Then Sarah nodded slowly, her face hardening with determination. "Thanks for the warning," she said, her voice firm. "But we can handle it." Jack nodded back, his expression unreadable. "I hope so." Before either of them could say another word, Jack turned on his heel and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness where Jack had been. "I don't like this," Michael muttered. He seemed too eager to leave. "I know," Sarah said quietly. "But we don't have a choice. We need to get to the compound, and we need to be prepared for whatever's waiting for us." They continued walking, but now a new sense of unease settled between them. They had been warned, but the warning had only raised more questions. Who were these people Jack had mentioned? And what kind of dangers awaited them inside the compound? It didn't take long before they came upon the perimeter of the compound, a high wall made of rusted metal and concrete, a remnant of what had once been a well-organized community. It was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of someone moving inside. The gates were heavily fortified, and it seemed like a far cry from the safety Sarah had hoped for. As they approached the gates, a loud voice rang out from above. "Who's there?" The voice was gruff and commanding, coming from a guard perched high on the wall. "We're looking for shelter," Sarah called back, her tone steady but wary. "We've been traveling for hours." There was a long pause. Then the voice responded, "You're not the first to come looking. Stay where you are. We'll decide if you're allowed in." Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance, and in that moment, Sarah realized just how much they were at the mercy of whatever lay beyond those walls. The gates of the compound creaked open with a grinding sound that echoed through the still night. The two guards, standing at the top of the wall, remained silent, their eyes watching Sarah and Michael closely. They were heavily armed, and their expressions were cold, as if they had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the terrifying. "Move," one of the guards commanded, gesturing for them to enter. Sarah and Michael exchanged another look. This was it, the moment they had been working toward for so long. But the unease still lingered. What kind of people would welcome strangers into their compound, only to greet them with such suspicion? They stepped through the gates cautiously, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them with an unsettling finality. The compound was far larger than Sarah had expected, stretching out into the distance, with a variety of makeshift buildings and structures, all designed for survival. A garden area near the center of the compound seemed to be growing vegetables, while the smell of food cooking wafted through the air, tempting their hungry stomachs. The compound wasn't a fortress, but it was well maintained, with clear signs of effort and organization. A few residents wandered between the buildings, but they kept their distance, eyeing Sarah and Michael as if they were potential threats. The cold atmosphere was palpable. The place felt almost like a prison. "Follow me," the guard said as he turned and started walking toward a small structure at the far end of the compound. It was the only building that looked more official, larger and more secure than the others. "Stay close," the other guard warned, his eyes narrowing. "And keep quiet. You'll speak to the leader soon enough." As they walked through the compound, Sarah couldn't help but notice the unsettling silence that seemed to hang over everything. The air was thick with tension, and the residents avoided eye contact. There were no children playing, no laughter. It was as if the people here had given up on joy, replacing it with survival. They finally reached the building, and the guard led them inside. It was a simple room, lit by dim overhead lights. There was a desk at the far side, and behind it sat a woman in her mid-40s. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and her posture rigid as she watched them enter. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic. The guard saluted her, his voice respectful. "Ma'am, we have 2 travelers. They claim they need shelter." The woman, presumably the leader, nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Sarah or Michael. "I'm Commander Vera," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "What's your business here?" "We've been traveling for days," Sarah spoke up, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're looking for safety. A place to rest and regroup." Vera's eyes studied them for a moment longer before she spoke again. "I understand. But you should know that this is not a charity. The compound is for those who contribute to our survival. You'll be expected to work, to help. Nothing comes for free in this world anymore." Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Sarah stayed focused. She had seen how these places worked. People banded together for survival, but that survival came at a price. Everyone had a role to play. "We're willing to help," Sarah said, meeting Vera's gaze head-on. "We can work, contribute." Vera's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, if it were genuine. "That's what I like to hear. Everyone here does their part. I can't afford any dead weight. You'll start tomorrow, first, We'll see if you can make yourself useful." "Thank you," Sarah replied, but the word tasted bitter on her tongue. The compound had the look of a place that didn't give out gratitude freely. She and Michael were led to a small room, barely more than a cot, a small table, and a chair. It was a far cry from what they had hoped for, but it was shelter. It was a roof over their heads, food in their bellies. And for the first time in days, they could breathe without the constant fear of being hunted. But even as she lay down on the hard cot, exhaustion seeping into her bones, Sarah's mind raced. She had heard what Jack had said, there was something off about this place. She could feel it in the air, like a thick cloud hanging over them. There was a darkness here, a hidden truth that nobody was talking about. Sarah closed her eyes but couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That somehow, they were not as safe as they seemed. The walls around them were thick, but not thick enough to hide the whispers that lingered just out of reach. Michael sat at the table, cleaning his rifle absent-mindedly. "Do you think we can trust them?" he asked, his voice low. "Is this really our best shot?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, turning over on the cot to face him. "But we don't have many options. Right now, this is our only chance." She fell silent, staring up at the ceiling. There was something unsettling about Vera. Something about the way she ran the compound. Sarah couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew they had to be careful. Trusting the wrong person here could be fatal. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease gnawing at her insides. They had made it this far, and they had to hold on to the hope that it wasn't too late to find a way out of this nightmare. Outside, the compound was still and quiet, but Sarah knew the calm wouldn't last. In this new world, peace was just a temporary illusion. And as the walls closed in around them, she couldn't help but wonder what other dangers were lurking, hidden beneath the surface. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah and Michael woke early every morning to the sharp clang of metal against metal, the sounds of the compound's residents preparing for the day ahead. There was little rest to be had here. The compound, while providing shelter, was not a sanctuary of peace. It was a place of survival, a place where everyone worked, and worked hard, just to hold on to the scraps of normalcy they had left. At first, Sarah and Michael tried to focus on their tasks, contributing as best as they could. Sarah was assigned to help with food preparation in the compound's makeshift kitchen, while Michael was tasked with assisting the guards with fortifying the walls and patrols. It was grueling work, but at least it kept their minds occupied. At least it gave them a semblance of purpose. Yet, the longer they stayed, the more Sarah began to notice things that didn't sit right. Small things, at first. The way some of the residents avoided looking at her when they passed. The whispers that seemed to fall silent the moment she entered a room. The cold, calculating way Vera handled the distribution of food and supplies. But it wasn't just the people that set her on edge, it was the compound itself. She had seen nothing resembling leadership or trust among the residents. There were no communal gatherings, no moments of respite. People were treated like cogs in a machine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. As the days wore on, Sarah's suspicions grew. She began to notice groups of people meeting in secret corners, exchanging looks that hinted at something more than just survival. There were hushed voices, quick glances, and half-hidden notes passed between them. It was as if there were factions within the compound, hidden agendas that no one was willing to talk about openly. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the compound were concealing far more than just zombies. One evening, after a long day of work, Sarah found herself in the mess hall, sitting alone at a corner table. Michael had been assigned to patrol that night, leaving her to eat in silence. The room was filled with the usual quiet hum of people eating, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the conversations she'd overheard, snippets of talk that made no sense. She had heard about something called the Council, a group that apparently made decisions for the compound. But she had yet to meet any of them. Suddenly, a shadow fell across her table, and she looked up to see a man standing before her. He was older, with a grizzled face and tired eyes, his clothes worn from constant use. He didn't seem to be someone who belonged to the leadership group, he was just another worker, someone trying to survive. But there was something about him that made Sarah pause. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, his voice rough but not unfriendly. Sarah nodded, unsure of his intentions. She had learned by now not to trust anyone too quickly, but there was something familiar about his demeanor. He didn't carry the same coldness that the others did. The man sat down across from her, his eyes scanning the room before he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You're new here, right?" "Yeah," Sarah replied, her gaze cautious. "Why?" He smirked, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "I've been here long enough to know when someone's out of place. And you've got that look. Like you don't quite trust what's going on." He paused, watching her closely. "You're not the only one." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around again, making sure no one was listening. "There's something off about this place. About Vera, and about the way things are run. There are secrets here, secrets you won't hear in the meetings, and things they don't want you to know. This place isn't what it seems." "Then why are you still here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man shrugged, his expression hardening. "Where else am I supposed to go? It's not like there are any other options. But trust me, you're not the first to start asking questions." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had known something was wrong, but now the reality of it was sinking in. "What kind of secrets?" The man's eyes darkened. "You've seen how people act here. Like they're scared, right? Like they're not living, just surviving. It's because they know what happens to anyone who tries to rock the boat. The council controls everything, and if you cross them, you disappear. They've been doing things to keep the peace, but it's not the kind of peace most people would accept if they knew." Sarah leaned in, her voice barely audible. "What kind of things?" He looked over his shoulder one last time, then spoke in a hushed tone. "You're being watched. All of you. They're not just protecting the compound from zombies, they're protecting it from the people inside. People who know too much have been taken. You'll never see them again. And if you dig too deep, you might disappear, too." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Her gut told her he was telling the truth. She didn't know how much longer she could stay in this place. The more she learned, the more the walls around her seemed to close in. Just then, the sound of boots clanking against the floor interrupted their conversation. The man quickly stood, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I've said enough," he muttered, his voice tight. "Just keep your eyes open. And if you value your life, don't go asking questions you don't want the answers to." Before Sarah could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Her mind was spinning, and for the first time since entering the compound, she felt a sense of real fear, not from the zombies outside, but from the people within. She stared down at her untouched meal, the weight of the man's words sinking in. The compound wasn't just a refuge from the world outside, it was a prison in its own right. And if she wasn't careful, she could become a prisoner too. The days following the conversation with the mysterious man felt like a slow unraveling. Sarah's mind was consumed with what he had said. Every creak of the compound's walls, every whispered conversation between residents, now felt like a warning. The compound wasn't the safe haven they had hoped for, it was a ticking time bomb, and Sarah and Michael were standing right next to it. The man's warning had stayed with Sarah like a shadow. She could feel eyes on her, the watchful gazes of the guards, the suspicious stares of the workers. She couldn't shake the sense that someone, somewhere, was waiting for her to make a move. And if she did, if she pushed too hard, there would be no way out. That night, after another grueling day of work, Sarah sat alone in her small room. The quiet hum of the compound outside did little to soothe her nerves. She could hear the distant cries of someone, probably another resident, faint but unmistakable. The walls, despite their strength, couldn't block out the desperation that seeped through the cracks. Michael had been assigned to another patrol that evening, and Sarah was left with her thoughts, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. She needed answers. but she also knew that asking those questions could cost her more than she was willing to lose. She sat by the small window in her room, peering out at the darkened compound. There, beyond the gates, the world was still filled with danger. Zombies roamed the streets, and anyone who ventured too far into the wasteland risked never returning. But inside the compound, the danger was more insidious. It was the danger of control, of manipulation, of power used to oppress rather than protect. The silence of the room was broken when there was a knock at her door. "Sarah," a familiar voice called. It was Michael. "I need to talk to you." Sarah quickly opened the door, her heart leaping in her chest. Michael's face was tense, his eyes darting around nervously. "What's wrong?" she asked, already knowing that whatever he was about to say wouldn't be good. "They know," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "About us. About our suspicions." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Michael stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "I overheard something today. The guards are talking about us. They know we've been asking questions. And it's only a matter of time before they come for us." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The walls were closing in faster than she could have anticipated. The compound had been built on lies and secrets, and now the truth was threatening to surface. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Michael exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I tried to talk to the man who warned you. But he's gone. No one's seen him since yesterday." Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. The man had warned her, but now he was gone. Disappeared without a trace. Was he another victim of the compound's ruthless system? Or had he left on his own, running from whatever dark force controlled the place? "There's only one choice left," Sarah said, her voice suddenly filled with resolve. "We leave. Tonight." Michael blinked, clearly surprised. "Leave? Are you crazy? The zombies outside." "I don't care," Sarah interrupted. "We can't stay here, not after everything we've learned. We've been trapped inside this place, thinking we were safe. But safety doesn't exist anymore. We either find a way out, or we become just like the others, lost, forgotten, and controlled." Michael hesitated, his gaze flickering to the door. "It's risky, Sarah. We don't know what's out there. What if we don't make it? Then we die trying," she said firmly. "But staying here isn't an option. We're not prisoners. We have to fight for our freedom." Michael met her gaze, and for the first time since they had arrived, Sarah saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew what she meant. He had felt it too, the heavy weight of the compound pressing down on them, suffocating their will to survive. Without another word, they gathered their things, barely more than a few personal items and the weapons they had scavenged over the weeks. Sarah checked her rifle, ensuring it was ready. They couldn't afford any mistakes now. As they slipped out of their room and into the darkened hallways of the compound, every step felt like a race against time. The compound was vast, and though it was heavily fortified, it wasn't impenetrable. There were weak spots in the fence, areas where the guards didn't patrol as closely. They had studied the layout enough to know where they needed to go. The guards were few, and they were mostly stationed at the main gates. It would be a dangerous escape, but they had no other choice. Just as they reached the compound's outer walls, Sarah caught sight of a figure in the shadows. It was the same man who had warned her before. He was standing there, waiting. "You came," he said softly, his voice urgent. "I knew you would. What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "You disappeared. Where did you go?" The man looked around nervously before stepping closer. "I've been watching. And I've been making sure you two had a way out. There's no time to explain, but you need to go. Now. The council knows you're planning to leave. They'll be after you the moment you step outside." Sarah nodded, the weight of the decision settling in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. With a final glance toward the compound, the place they had hoped would be their salvation, Sarah and Michael took their first steps into the unknown. The world outside was filled with terror, but it was theirs to face. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. They were free. For better or worse, they had chosen their own fate.